so much for having me here. I am one of your neighbors. So First Christian Reformed Church is about 20 minutes walk from here, and I live very close to the church. So it's on 11th Avenue in Victoria. You might have seen it because it is right next to that very tall Welcome Center, and it's the Immigrant Services Society of BC Welcome Center. And so at the church, we can literally see in each other's windows. We can see in the windows of the Immigrant Services Society Welcome Center, which meant we could see when Justin Trudeau and Sophie Trudeau and Prince William and Princess Kate all came to open the playground at the Welcome Center. It was the most well-attended coffee time at our church ever. There were like heads stacked up, and the media was taking photos of the church windows because there were so many people. But it's been a real privilege to be their neighbors just for about 3 years now. So I'm what's called a commissioned pastor at the church, which means I'm commissioned very specifically for a specific role. And in my case, that is to support people who have arrived in Canada as refugees, and to work with churches and others who are supporting those newcomers. So particularly, I very often meet people who are living at the Welcome Center in transitional housing, or who are accessing the services there. But really, I meet a variety of people I meet them through a variety of ways as well. And so my work really is a mishmash of a lot of different things. Every day is different. But the best part about it is that I do get to spend a lot of time meeting people from a lot of different cultures and backgrounds and faiths and stories. And I had hoped to have one of those people join us here today to share a little bit about her story. It can be a very sensitive thing to ask someone to share, especially because so many of the people I meet are so new that they're in a particularly vulnerable position at the time when I first meet them. So it can be difficult to identify someone. I did have someone in mind, but she has been facing some health issues lately, so she could not join us, so I'm sorry about that. But my hope today, and I'll probably fail at it in different ways, but is that I do not want to talk for refugees or about them, but my hope really is to share some of what I've been learning as I've been walking alongside of them, and share some of what I'm still learning. So that's one of my goals for today. So Beth asked what passage I wanted to preach on, and I said a passage from Matthew 25 because it's been a passage that's been annoying me lately. Or actually, I should say the way that we often use it has been frustrating me because of what I've been learning in my work. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that frustration. So here it is. It's Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 to 46, and I'm reading from the New International Version. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. They will also answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. We respond, the gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So this is the word of the Lord. And I mean, these are quite literally the words from Jesus' mouth. And I think these are words of Jesus that we generally love. I generally love them. So you might have been surprised that this is the passage that I said has been annoying me. I mean, I've quoted these words, I've heard others quote them, and usually it's in situations that I generally agree with. You know, should we support people who have found themselves homeless? Should we welcome a stranger? Should we support development agencies doing good work in other countries? And the answer we say or hear is so often, yes, we should, because Jesus says, whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done for me. But the thing is that for me, the more people who have found themselves refugees that I've gotten to know, the more frustrated I've become with the way that I hear us using this passage, or the way that it seems to me we are using this passage. It feels like I hear, in my use of it and in others' use of it, that the people we keep calling the least of these are in some ways people that we actually think of as lesser than us. People to be helped, people to be pitied, people who are other, and people who are not us. And more, this has become increasingly disconnected from my own experiences with the people that I meet. So think of Syrians, for example. I think that if I asked many Canadians what they think of when they hear the word Syria, they're going to say refugees. They're going to say a bombed out country, thousands of people fleeing, and people who need our help. People who are the least of these. But I realize that when I think of Syria, I actually think first of a beautiful country that I visited several times before the war. I think of incredibly hospitable people. I think of the amazing city of Damascus. And I think of, in my opinion, what is the best food in the world. I think of people who welcomed me, who fed me, who got my suitcase back when I ended up on a bus at the Turkish border, which was very far from where I was, so I literally had only the clothes I was wearing. So I think of Syrians as people who helped me. Our use of this passage was also feeling disconnected with my experience, because it didn't also seem to fit with the way that it seems like Jesus treats people all throughout Scripture, with dignity, with engagement, as people who have the ability of their own to make decisions and to help themselves. People who don't need pity, but need empathy, need engagement, need allies. I mean, Jesus himself was a refugee, so he identified so personally with these kinds of situations. But even though I was feeling this disconnection, I couldn't totally put words to it. And it was actually a man named Muhammad who articulated things better for me. So I met Muhammad, who is a Syrian, a couple of years ago, just after he arrived in Canada. He had agreed to participate in and help me with a project that I was working on. And I was asking him what it meant to him to be a refugee and how Canadians could help people like him. And he looked at me and he said, I don't even like this word refugee. He said, it makes me think of somebody who is poor and helpless, and that is not what I am. And the next thing he said to me was, and I also don't like this word help. He said, Canadians have done so much already. Instead of helping, he said, and he went like this. He said, I want us to put our hands together, to work together for Canadian society. So here I am, thinking I'm living out Matthew 25, thinking of Muhammad as the least of these, and he is having none of it. So I thought, I better look at this passage again. And as I did, I realized that the way that Jesus' disciples first heard these words is not necessarily the way that we read them today or quote them. And I began to wonder if listening to their interpretation might help us hear and quote and live out this passage differently. So what I'm hoping we can do for a minute is enter the disciples' world. So by the time we get to this part of the Gospel of Matthew, the disciples have been sitting at the feet of Jesus for quite a while. They've been following him around across Palestine, listening to him and watching him as he preaches and teaches and performs miracles and spends time with people. And the longer the disciples are with him, the more all of their expectations about who Jesus is and what he's doing on earth are being challenged and flipped. So they thought they knew exactly what Israel's Savior King was going to look like. If you would ask them the question that Mark asked this morning, they would have had all these words coming to mind. They thought he was going to bring this earthly conquering kingdom. They thought that he was going to establish an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem, a powerful kingdom. They thought that he was going to bring Israel all the glory. And they thought they knew what it was going to mean for them to follow this king. But with every word Jesus speaks and every action he takes, he turns what they thought they knew upside down. They begin to see, very slowly, that Jesus' kingdom is actually flipped from what they expected. They begin to see, still slowly, that Jesus is actually a servant, a humble one, a suffering one who's going to bring a kingdom, but it's a kingdom that will involve his death. And they begin to see that the kingdom is here now, but it's also not yet here. And until it's actually here in the new creation, they have a lot of work to do. And as Jesus communicates all of this to them, he begins to prepare them. He's teaching them to carry on this upside-down kingdom work. Work that's not about money or power or earthly glory, but about the command, love your neighbor as yourself, and love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. It's work for a new creation where wealth is shared, especially with those in need. Work for a new creation in which, as he tells the crowds in the Sermon on the Mount, the blessed ones are the poor in spirit, the mourning, the meek, the merciful, and the peacemakers. And throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that Jesus says to his disciples, as you do this new creation work, you are called to be, literally uses the words, little ones. You are the ones called to put yourselves last, he says in Matthew 19. You are the ones called to have faith like a child. And he says to them, you who do my new creation work, you are my brothers, a term we can also think of as meaning siblings. It's a personal and it's an intimate term that the Gospel of Matthew actually uses only for Jesus' disciples. So the disciples have all of these upside-down expectations running through their minds. And they're starting to understand that Jesus is probably going to die. But they're also pretty convinced that he's going to come again, though they're not sure. And actually, they're feeling pretty unsure about everything. And on top of it all, they've realized that Jesus is giving them a huge responsibility to carry on his work even when he's not physically with them anymore. So they're really looking for some reassurance here. So at the beginning of Matthew 25, they come to him for a private conversation, just Jesus and the disciples on the top of the Mount of Olives. And they ask him, you have to tell us, when are you going to come and make everything right again? And how are we going to know? And Jesus does what he usually does, which he does not actually answer them directly. But he is really honest with them. He tells them that everything, or most things at least, are going to get worse before they get better. He tells them that they are going to have to suffer for participating in this upside-down kingdom vision, because it's not what people, especially powerful people, want to hear. But he reminds them, you have to keep living out this good news anyways. He tells them through parables, you don't know when I'm coming again. It could be 10 days, it could be 100 years. But that doesn't matter because you have to get to work right now. You have to use the gifts I've given you, and you have to be faithful and wise servants right now, even when the suffering gets worse. But he says, remember that I am God and I am just, and I will judge the nations for how they care for you while you are doing my kingdom work. In the same way that the Palestinian shepherds carefully examined their flocks to separate the sheep from the goats, I will carefully examine how you, my siblings, how you, my little ones, have been cared for or not cared for. So to say it again, when Matthew tells us about Jesus saying, whatever you have done for the least of these my brothers, you have done for me, when he uses these personal terms, which again, he's only used for the disciples would have heard, whatever you have done for us, for the followers of Jesus, you have done for me. And hearing that interpretation, that challenge, has been a struggle for me. Because even though I dug into this passage because it was annoying me, this was not exactly what I expected to hear. So at first, I thought that I was struggling with it because it sounds so exclusive. Like, what do you mean that Jesus is going to judge other people based on how they treat me? I mean, maybe that sounds nice on the days when I think I've been treated unfairly, but it still sounds to me really self-absorbed, and it doesn't fit with the rest of the message of Scripture. But as I thought about it more, I think I had to be honest with myself that the real reason I'm still struggling with this interpretation is because if followers of Jesus are actually the least of these, if Jesus are saying that Christians are the hungry, the thirsty, the poor, the lonely, the sick, and the imprisoned, then what exactly does that make me? Because I am none of those things. But Jesus seems to be saying, if you are really participating in my upside-down kingdom the way I'm calling you to, you should be the least of these. And what do I do with that? Because even though I was feeling frustrated with this passage, and even though there was a disconnect for me with the way I feel it's used, my previous interpretation of it, where the other people are the least of these, was a lot more comfortable. Because I could say, well, that's about the other people. And I'm doing God's call because I'm helping them. So I got it covered. But then a friend reminded me that the gospel should always comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And in my discomfort, I've been learning a few different things. First, if I, or if we, are the least of these, then all of our expectations about how we serve others needs to be flipped upside down to go back to the idea of Jesus' upside down kingdom. Or actually, it's more like leveled out. Because I think the church has become pretty good at serving others, especially as it has grown in people and resources. We've built soup kitchens to feed the hungry. We've organized clothing drives to clothe the poor. We've funded community initiatives to give people places to gather when they're lonely. We've started prison ministries and we've built hospitals. And all of these things can be good things. But so often in doing this, we've defaulted to a model in which we are up here, serving those who we think are the least of these, who are down there. This service, in my experience, often keeps us very separated, and it keeps us from really actually entering each other's lives, especially the lives of others who are a lot different than us. And it keeps them from really entering our lives. We forget about Jesus' kingdom, in which, as the prophet Isaiah tells us, every valley will be raised up, and every mountain and hill will be made low. The rough ground will become level, Isaiah says, the rugged places plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. And I'll be honest that I do often see this default model in myself and in my own work. Within a model of Matthew 25, where others are the least of these, I can too easily twist Jesus' words and turn them into a checklist. So I look at my neighbors, the refugees living temporarily at the Welcome Center, and I can think, okay, so I'm going to make sure you get a welcome box so you have food. I'm going to make sure you know the coffee's on so you have drink. I'm going to make sure that I organize a clothing drive so you have clothes. I'm going to ask the church to pay your medical bills, and I'm going to find volunteers to visit you and support you. So there, I can go home, I can pat myself on the back, I can say that I've covered all of Jesus' commands in Matthew 25. I can tell myself that I saw Jesus in those I was assisting, and I can tell myself that I was a servant. But at the end of the day, at the end of that checklist, I'm still up here, and they're still down there. And that was what Muhammad reminded me of when he told me that he didn't like the word help, and he didn't like the stereotype of a refugee. He was indirectly saying what another Syrian named Refugee said directly when he wrote, "Refugees are not objects or vehicles of inspiration and sympathy." When he asked us to put our hands together to work for the better of Canadian society, Muhammad was asking me to see him as a person, not an object of my sympathy. He was asking me to consider the truth that he has a lot to contribute, and that he has a lot to give me. And that's the second thing that I've been learning as I try to think about what it means for me to be the least of these. And that is how to receive. So last year I met an Iraqi woman named Nadia, who came to Canada with her family as a refugee a few years ago. Shortly after I met her, she came to what our church calls our weekly community night dinner, a weekly neighborhood supper that we used to run that we opened up to anyone and everyone. So Nadia is Muslim, but as she sat there at dinner that first night, she said to me, "This church feels like a family to me." So the very next week, Nadia showed up at 4 o'clock, just as our volunteers were starting to prepare dinner. And to all of our surprise, she was loaded with groceries, and she started to cook. And she cooked up a feast. And this kept happening. She kept coming. She kept giving and giving and giving. And I protested to her. We all protested to her. On the one hand, I think our protesting was important, because we wanted Nadia to know that our dinner is open to all and that she had no obligation. We wanted her to know that we understand that finances are a struggle for most people who arrive as refugees, even several years after they get here. And we wanted her to know that we were able as a church to pay for the meal. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of our protests came because she was flipping the story that we wanted to tell ourselves. Because again, we defaulted to the idea that she is a little refugee who needs our help, and we are supposed to be helping her. But as I continued to talk with her and eat her food, I began to realize, for one thing, that she's a way better cook than any of our cooks. But I also began to see how important it was for her to be able to give. And I realized how often in my work, I actually deny people, in my case refugees, that chance. I deny them the chance to give, the chance to repeat Muhammad's words, to join hands and work together. And I wondered how it might change us to remember how much we have to receive from others and to learn how to receive it. And this isn't a comfortable position for me, or I think for many of us, because the way it often works in our society is that the position of giving is the position of power. So the minute we put ourselves in the position of receiving, we lose some of that power. Maybe we become a little more actually like the least of these. But in that loss of power, I'm learning a third and final lesson, which is that I, like all of us, am broken and in need. Because that was Jesus' message to the disciples too. Elsewhere in Matthew, he says, "It's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. For go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not burnt sacrifice. For I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners." I need the mercy of Jesus, and I need the mercy of other people. In the more familiar interpretation of the story in the sheep and the goats, I am reminded to see Christ in other people. But the reality is that there are so many days when I desperately need people to see Jesus in me. Days when I'm tired or grumpy, or I say the wrong thing, or I do the wrong thing, or days when I'm just struggling, or days when I treat refugees as other, or as less than, even despite my best intentions. So what if I were to ask for mercy from those people who came as refugees? What would it mean for me to tell them that I do need their help and their forgiveness? What would it mean for me to admit that? What would it mean for all of us to say to refugees around the world, we need you, instead of just, we'll help you? And then what if we tried to figure out what that actually looks like? And as we do, I think we may understand then better why Jesus' words were such a comfort to the disciples. Because all of these things, standing in solidarity with those who are typically marginalized, putting ourselves in a position to receive, putting ourselves in a place where we admit our own brokenness and need. I think all of this puts us in a place where we're closer to moments where we better understand what it means for us to be the least of these. And in those moments, we might also understand what it means for Jesus to identify with us. Because underlying this passage is a reminder that Jesus sees, and Jesus is just. He doesn't leave his workers alone, but he calls all of the nations to see them and to care for them. And I think here we sometimes get hung up on the judgment part of the passage. And we do have to talk about it because it's a significant part of the passage. So we ask ourselves, well, who are the goats and who are the sheep and what's the inheritance and what is this eternal fire? But as a number of the commentators note, the disciples would have heard this judgment part of the story as a two-part reminder. First, Jesus will come again. He will make things new. He will reorder creation around his upside-down kingdom. That's the hope. Second, Jesus is already here. His justice is already at work, even on the days where it's really difficult to see. And when I think about 65 million people displaced in the world, 25 million of whom have official refugee status, that makes it hard to know how that justice is at work. But it is. The theologian N.T. Wright suggests that the judgment in this passage doesn't begin in some future time, but instead it began the day that Jesus rose from the dead, which was the very first day of the upside-down kingdom. Here, says Wright, Jesus is shown as launching his followers on their dangerous and vulnerable mission as his siblings, with the knowledge that he, their older brother, is already ruling the world and seeing what they suffer. When we enter into the call to struggle with and act on Christ's teaching about the upside-down kingdom, he never leaves us alone in it. He doesn't just ascend to heaven and leave us here to figure it out. He stays with us, he identifies with us, and as Matthew tells us later, he leaves his Spirit with us, our comforter and our advocate. Because it's really only through the work of the Spirit that we do any of this. In my church's welcome of those who have found themselves refugees, and as we've been trying to figure out what it means to be the least of these, the Spirit has been a great comfort. A comfort in the hard stories we hear, the helplessness we often feel, the many ways we fail to level out the power imbalances, and the ongoing challenges we're trying to face. But as we've been trying to focus on people over programs, and focus on names and stories and cups of tea over checklists, we found that our challenges have been reframed as well. So before, I would have told you that some of my biggest challenges are how best to help with food and clothing and rent and isolation and how to raise money for all of that. But now, though these are still absolutely pressing issues, I actually have two bigger challenges. The first is, honestly, I cannot provide enough volunteer opportunities for all of the people, refugees, who want to help me and and help the church. These are refugees constantly offering help to me. And the second is that I honestly cannot convince these people who have come as refugees that I really physically can't eat all of the food that they are cooking for me. This is a real problem. I always call people, okay, I'm gonna come visit, I only have an hour, I ate already, it's fine, and then I get there and dinner, and it's always such good food, like you can't say no, but it is a struggle. So little by little, I think we are trying to figure this out together. And the other day, a woman from Iraq said to me, I've so often felt less than human during my refugee journey, before I got to Canada, but even now that I'm here. But she said, I keep coming to this church because you treat me like a human being here. And I think that's part of what my prayer is, that we will continue to do. We have so much to learn. And I think I will wrestle with this passage for the rest of my life. I think that's why I got so wordy in trying to explain it, because I still haven't figured it out. Like, what does this mean? What do I do with it? I think that's an important challenge, and I think it's a challenge not least because I have so much privilege. And we have so much privilege just by being Canadian citizens. I mean, that fact alone means probably we will never really know what it means to be a refugee. So I am so grateful to people like Mohammed and people like Nadia for, Mohammed for calling me out on my words when I needed calling out, for Nadia for just showing up with that food persistently. They didn't need to teach me, but they have, and I'm so grateful, and I pray to keep learning from them and others like them. So thank you so much for letting me share today.